yeah, like if I play down, it's like a decision tree at the top, right? Which the which the business partner is helping go through, right? Like what are you procuring? Is it a personnel or is it a service? And if it's a service, is there a fixed milestone, or you want people to come through that service contract in order to do it? So that's how you kind of break it down. Even when it's full time that you're getting a personnel, there are questions like, do you see the role remain the same over the next 2 years, or you think this will evolve or change depending upon how the growth of your organization looks like? Because if a manager is not sure a role is going to look the same a year or two down the line, then what's the point of hiring a full-time employee? Might as well hire a temp worker, right? So that decision tree that kind of aligns, and then from there, if you determine it's temp or ICs, it goes to CT. If it's full-time employee, you pull your TA function, and if it's pure services procurement, then you pull your procurement function into it. Your procurement function, of course, owns contracting and supplier management and all of it. But after that, if you want milestone tracked, etc., onboarding of employees, etc., then there may be a connect to CT, right? And so that's how I see it.
Yeah, exactly. Because even if an outsourced service provider is they're providing a service which involves doing some work. There'll be people
Yeah,
doing some of that work. Um, and obviously for compliance purposes, they need to be onboarded to be able to have building access, systems access, all of that sort of stuff.
correct.
And it does kind of cross over. So you've got a central part of the organization coordinating it. One of the things that I found quite interesting that you've spoken about with regards to this before was just that strategic element of saying you need to plan what you need to do first. And I think you described that to me as kind of getting ahead of the problem.
Right.
Um, that's it's and that needs to be happening on an ongoing basis, really, doesn't
Yeah,
it? You can't just say, what work are we going to get done this year? Who knows
correct.
what's going to happen this year? The world changes so fast. That's
Exactly.
that's that's an interesting function, but you kind of need the data to drive that, don't you?
Yeah, no, absolutely. You need internal data, which means your HRIS and the VMS and your procurement systems needs to come together in order to provide that intelligence. And of course, you need external market data to come in order to help the HRBP to take the most reliable, insights-driven outcomes to the business, right? Also, there was one thing that I wanted to point out, which I'm missing now. Oh yeah, for example, you mentioned about nipping all of these problems that are downstream in terms of compliance and extra spend and all of it right at the beginning. Decisions like location strategy as well, like has to be determined at the top, right? Because today, if a work has to be done, it doesn't have to be that it has to be done in Singapore, right? It could be done from another location where you will have a cost advantage, or you have your shared services and those kind of things. So you got to think about it from that perspective too, and that comes up higher up in the chain.
Yeah, absolutely. The great thing about all this, and the thing that really I find very invigorating about this sort of conversation, is it's about being strategic, it's about getting things done, it's about being effective. That really appeals to me. I love that. That's how I like to operate. So I do find this such an interesting topic.
Yeah.
One of the things that I really like about the way you approach this is this concept of a moving towards a skills-based workforce architecture. I would maybe even call it like a capacity and capability architecture, but it's the ability of the organization to get stuff done,
Yeah.
got to be put into the right boxes, hasn't it? Of what is it you need to do?
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely. And I see many organizations do that. Like many organizations today are implementing an internal marketplace.
Right.
And an internal marketplace is just that, right? Like you know where your employees are, what skills and capabilities do they have, what projects are they doing which have transferable skills, so that you have a mapping. And tomorrow when you have, let's say, a requirement, and that requirement is something that you don't want to go out and hire, is there somebody internally who wants to move? So that's where your internal mobility question comes up. And if that work that you want to get done, can it be packaged as a project, can be extended as a stretch project, or somebody who wants to build skills, etc., or wants to move into that function, can they take on that project and do it for a while within your organization? So that's where that flexibility of having your people develop skills, you knowing where the skills are sitting, and how can you enable internal mobility comes in, and then you extend it to external world too. If it's not available internally, how would you go out and get those capabilities for you?
Yeah, I've seen some interesting approaches uh, to this sort of kind of philosophy. And for some organizations, particularly if they're working in like highly technological areas, they tend to employ what they refer to as like horizon planning.
Hmm.
So these are all the things that we do now. These are the
Right.
kind of ways that we do that. What about the things that we don't do now
Hmm.
that we think we're going to need to do? And I mean, that must have been something that was something that Netflix had to consider in terms
Yeah.
of, like you talk about VFX and stuff like that. You know, the latest technologies, use of AI within the kind of like, you know, entertainment industry and all that sort of thing.
Yeah.
People need to look down the road because we're driving faster.
That is true. Yeah. You need to know what's happening now in the next year or two, what's going to happen like over the next 3 to 4 years, and then also long term, right? Like where are we headed? And if every function has that, then that's going to guide them well.
And it's interesting when you look at the ability of the organization to flex and do what they need to do. It's partly about like internal talent, then it's about contingent talent, and you could break that down into skills and competencies and say we got this much resource in these, you know,
Yeah.
X many different areas. The interesting thing about the statement of work and services procurement side of things is you're dealing with organizations on the other end of that that are also evolving and they are building their skills and they may be building their skills before you need them. But if you don't
Mhm.
have visibility of that, if you don't have those relationships and you don't have that line of sight, and this say this kind of horizon planning, I've seen it a lot within like the defense sector and like
Mhm.
high tech engineering, aerospace, that sort of areas. Um, those type of industries, they utilize, and I don't know if this is anything that you've come across before, but they tend to utilize within their services supply chain things called expressions of interest. So
Right.
when they're starting to actually like do this future analysis and this horizon planning, they'll go out to their supply chain and say, who does
Mhm.
this? Who has
This.
knowledge of X? Who can do Y? Who manages these particular technologies or who has a capability or who's building a capability in this area? And rather than it being a specific engagement of right, we're looking for somebody to do this right now, it's saying if and when this comes up, who's any good at this? Who's got capability? I find that
Right.
really interesting because that's something that if you're gathering that information in advance, you're really starting to think strategically, and you can flip that expression of interest into a requirement, a hard requirement at any period of time. And that for those types of industries where I've seen that happen, um, it allows them to work around effectively building that supply chain as
Mhm.
well. So to say,
Yeah.
okay, our supply chain's great, but we've got these new areas, and actually nobody in our supply chain is even thinking about doing this.
Yeah.
We need to go out and source those suppliers and put them
Right.
on our kind of like, you know, build our supplier ecosystem further. Is that something you've come across at all?
So not in terms of that per se, but in my previous roles, of course, supplier strategy, which was owned by procurement, of course, had these touch points with suppliers to know what other technologies are they getting into, what others um, uh, industries that they are doing projects in, etc. So that was a touch point. That was understanding of the supplier that the procurement team used to own predominantly for two reasons, right? Because as an organization, you're also thinking about what's our core work and what's our non-core work, right? And once you define that, your core is not going to anybody, right? You have to keep it. Like for example, Netflix engineering, right, or the algorithm is not going to go to a supplier, right? So you don't need to know that. But anything else, right, which is peripheral, maybe, right? So if you want to think in terms of horizons, and these are things that are coming up. Is it core, non-core? If it's non-core, can we find out if our existing supply base has that potential or not? Yeah.
Yeah, so when you look at this concept of a skills-based architecture, if that, I guess again, that plays into your thinking around it being need to be managed by a centralized orchestrating function, and whatever that function is. Um, it's really interesting what you just said about there about the supplier strategy. So that data from procurement,
Has to come.
absolutely, it has to feed in. So would you see it being like a unified skills architecture just across that? It's the organizational architecture. It's not an HR architecture.
Yeah. Correct. It's what the organization will need, right? Because it can't be HR. It has to be
Yeah.
for all the different functions, which means that it has to be fed from from the different business units up, right? And then it becomes one unified architecture. The thing is also, I mean, I keep hearing this like there are a lot of proponents of the skills based architecture, and there are also detractors, right? And if you look at here, the detractors, what they would say is, how do you know the skills that an employee is saying that I know is really skills they own, right? For example, like when we implemented internal marketplace, I had to go create my profile. And in that profile, of course, I could put my LinkedIn profile, the experiences, etc. The system would say, okay, based on your experience, these are skills that you have. You can add more, right? Maybe you've done a Python course, etc. You can add. I can add anything, right? And then that becomes a skills architecture, right? So is that accurate? Is that not accurate? And also skills are changing too, right? Like what a role may need today is different from what it needs 6 months down the line. So how do you keep it refreshed? How do you ensure that it's more accurate? So there are a lot of other dynamics that plays out when you look at implementing it and ensuring that it runs, which maybe AI plays a role in kind of keeping it all
Oh,
together.
100%. I was literally just about to say that. I think this is a real area where our AI can play a role. I mean, we
Yeah.
see it in supplier capabilities. So within Zivio, if an organization has their services supply chain in there, you can look at these capabilities and you look at this skills-based taxonomy effectively. And one of the things that AI is amazing at doing is looking at the requirements, the skills and attributes and competencies in a requirement, the capabilities needed, and actually assessing a supplier,
Mm.
looking at everything that they talk about, looking at the past work they've done for that organization, looking at the competencies that maybe they've achieved kind of accreditations for and things like that. And it can give really interesting recommendations on the suitability of a particular supplier for particular types of competencies.